Welcome to the Georgia Archives April 2022 Lunch and Learn program. I'm Penny Cliff, Education Specialist here at the Georgia Archives. We are appreciative that JoyEllen Williams has agreed to record her presentation, How to Become a Book Detective, the Analysis of Rare and Historic Books. JoyEllen is a Special Collections Curator in the Department of Museums, Archives and Rare Books at Kennesaw State University. In her role, she manages collection development, collection management, outreach initiatives, and exhibitions for the Bentley Rare Book Museum. JoyEllen is a certified archivist and holds a bachelor's degree in English from the University of Georgia and a master's degree in archival studies from Clayton State University. She serves as a governor-appointed member of the Georgia Historical Records Advisory Council and as a board member of the Society of American Archivists Publications Board. She is also a founding member of the Atlanta Black Archives Alliance. JoyEllen has published articles and chapters in various professional publications, including Archival Issues, Participatory Heritage, Archival Outlook, and Pushing the Margins, Women of Color and Intersectionality in LIS. Welcome, JoyEllen. We're glad you're here.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. And again, I'm JoyEllen Williams, Special Collections Curator in the Department of Museums, Archives, and Rare Books at Kennesaw State University. So today, we're going to talk about how to become a book detective, the analysis of rare and historic books. First, I'll introduce you to the Bentley Rare Book Museum where I work. The Bentley Rare Book Museum at Kennesaw State University is the only rare book museum in Georgia, and our mission is to develop and preserve collections of rare and historic books to engage communities in the history of the book. In our collection, we have over 10,000 rare books and manuscripts. And in my role, I manage collection development and preservation, exhibitions, research, outreach, all these exciting things for the rare book collection. Today, we're going to examine a few books that reflect different periods in Georgia's history, but we're going to go much deeper than their content. We're going to become book detectives and engage in what book historians call analytical bibliography. Analytical bibliography is the study of books as objects. So today, we're going to study clues that these books give us, not only to reconstruct the life of each book, but also to determine the larger role they play in our world's literary and historical narrative. This is going to be a lot of fun. And just so you know, all images in this presentation are courtesy of the Bentley Rare Book Museum, unless otherwise noted. Before we get started, let's go over a little terminology. So, bibliography. Most of us know this word to mean the list of sources at the end of a research paper, and that is not wrong. That is a type of bibliography called enumerative bibliography. But what we're going to do today is engage in analytical bibliography, which is, again, the study of books as material objects. Next is the hand press period. This is the period when books were made by hand and no part of the bookmaking process was automated. The paper in books was made by hand, the type that was used for the print was made and set by hand, and the bindings were all made by hand. In the West, this period extends from circa 1500 to 1800 CE. We contrast the hand press period with the machine press period. This is the period when the Industrial Revolution and emerging machine technology automated parts of the bookmaking process. This period lasted from about 1800 to 1950 CE, before the rise of electronic technology and computing. And now, finally, the electronic digital period. This isn't really the official name of that period in book history. I've actually yet to find a standard name for the period that we're actually currently living in. But it really refers to when the emergence of electronic computing, the internet, and digital media further transformed the bookmaking process and fostered the development of media that now coexist and compete with the printed word. So you'll hear me reference these periods throughout the presentation, because understanding the time period in which a book was produced helps us interpret the clues that we find within the book. So let's get started. All right, so the first book that we're going to look at today is called A Historical Account of the Rise and Progress of the Colonies of South Carolina and Georgia. So what a mouthful. This is a 2-volume book printed in 1779. And the content of the book is quite interesting. It documents, from a British colonizer's perspective, the establishment of South Carolina and Georgia as colonies, often describing interactions between the British colonists and the indigenous people who already lived in these regions. But again, we're not going to focus on the content of this book as much, because we're going to look at this book as an artifact. So the way I like to begin book detective work is to analyze from the outside in. That means we're going to be exploring the binding first. All right, so we're going to zoom in a little bit on this binding. Okay, so the first thing that we notice about this book is that, well, it is bound. That might sound basic, but we can't take that for granted when we discuss hand-press period books. During this time period, people bought books from print shops or booksellers. Books were not the products of the established, all-inclusive publishing companies that we're accustomed to today. So when someone bought a book, they essentially received a stack of folded and sewn sheets, usually enclosed in a pretty lackluster paper wrapper or some very humble paper boards. It was the book buyer's job to pay for a nicer binding. And in the hand-press period, this binding was usually made of leather, or at least partially so. So we see that at this binding, a previous owner did that. And also now, just as an aside, we can't always judge a book by its binding. So you can't always assume that a book from the hand-press period is in its first binding, or that it was bound the same time that it was printed. This binding, however, again, is very typical of the late 18th century London, and so we can confirm it as from the period. This 2-volume set is quarter bound in leather. So again, quarter bound means that just the spine has leather, and we've got these wonderful marbled boards on the covers. So what we basically can learn from this, the clue it gives us, is that someone at some point in time really cared about this book enough to get it bound like this. Okay, so now we are going to discuss the paper. We're going to move inward a bit. All right, so here we're getting a good look at the paper. So during the hand-press period, paper was not made from trees and wood pulp. It was made from linen rags that were soaked, rotted, mashed to a pulp, and then all of that substance was poured onto a wire mold and left to dry. When that big sheet of paper had fully dried on the mold, it was taken off and it retained the impressions from the wire mold in the form of chain lines and watermarks. So if you look really closely, you can probably see some lines, a few little bit of these lines. You can see some of the texture of the paper. So these markings confirm that the paper was made by hand. So I want to show something else. So this is a picture of me working with a different book. So not the book that we're talking about today, but I wanted to show this because it demonstrates those chain lines really well. So in order to see the chain lines, it's really best to hold a book up to the light, and I circled this digitally so you all can see these impressions here, and then we see a watermark, part of the watermark. So all of this you can see when you hold a hand-pressed book up to the light. On certain pages you can see this. And again, you can even use just a phone like I used. So it's really exciting to explore all that the paper of a hand-pressed book has to offer. All right. So next, we're going to go back to our book that we're talking about, and we're going to talk about the type and the printing. So during this period, the type was set and printed by hand using a printing press. And even though we don't have this book in front of us right now, if you did, one thing I would encourage you to do is to gloss your hand gently over the page. That's something that I often do with our hand-pressed books, with washed hands, washed and dried hands, of course. But what you would feel is that there's texture to it. You can literally feel the impression of the metal type that was made into the handmade paper. It's really a one-of-a-kind type of feel. So we're going to go ahead and dive into the text. As you can see, we've got a title page. We're used to that. Title pages have been common in books since the beginning of the 16th century. Before that, information that you would normally find on the title page would actually be in the back of the book, and that was called a colophon. But we've got a title page today, and so on this page there is a clue that I want us to note. I'll zoom in. See at the bottom here, it says printed for Alexander Donaldson, and it gives an address in London. That's a really good book clue. But can we actually know who Alexander Donaldson was? Why, yes, we can. So a very useful book for us book detectives is called A Dictionary of the Printers and Booksellers Who Were at Work in England, Scotland, and Ireland. This reference book was compiled by Henry Plomer and others. There are several volumes of this text, and its goal is to catalog all of the notable English printers and booksellers throughout the 17th and 18th centuries in the UK. So again, this is a reference text that some scholars have put together. So I found an entry for Alexander Donaldson in the volume that spans from 1726 through 1775. I figured that Alexander Donaldson was probably printing then or selling books then. And so I found his entry. And from this entry, I learned that Alexander Donaldson was a bookseller in both Edinburgh and London. What a helpful clue. But here's something even better. So I wasn't able to capture the entire entry that I found for him because it went onto a different page, but I'll tell you about it. I found from the full entry that from 1773 through 1788, Alexander Donaldson operated at 48 St. Paul's Churchyard. And what do we see on the title page? We see the exact location where we would expect to find Mr. Donaldson in 1779, 48 St. Paul's Churchyard in London. Now we also have another clue on the title page. In the upper right-hand corner, We also see who owned the book. This is called an ownership signature. And this was likely written during the time period as well, or around the 18th century. You can kind of tell by how the ink looks. So although I don't know who this person is, we can use clues to make a guess. This book is very historical in nature, and it was written by a man named Alexander Hewitt. By the way, he's not mentioned on the title page, but there's a lot of scholarly research that has determined him to be the author. And Alexander Hewitt was an Englishman who lived in Charleston for several years. So perhaps the reader of this text was interested in history. Maybe the reader had a scholarly bent. And if they were the person responsible for commissioning the binding for this book, we also know that they had sufficient funds to care for their books. So there's a lot more I could talk about, but in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and say that this case is closed on this book. Let's open a new case. We're going to fast forward in time by 124 years. So now we're in the machine press period, which again began in the early 19th century and would last until about the mid 20th century. This is the time period when the bookmaking process experienced more automation thanks to the Industrial Revolution and increased machine power. During this time period, most paper was machine-made as opposed to handmade. We started seeing more typefaces and fonts. Press work was more efficient and often had steam power added to it. And larger publishing companies started gaining strength. And now, for one of the biggest changes, books were actually sold with permanent bindings issued by the publisher. These were called publisher's bindings. Most publisher's bindings were made with cloth. So the book from this period that we are going to investigate is one of the most significant texts written on race in America. It is called The Souls of Black Folk, and it was published in 1903. This book of essays was authored by W.E.B. Du Bois. Although Du Bois was born in Maryland and educated at Harvard, he has a very strong Georgia connection. For many years, Du Bois was a professor and scholar at Atlanta University, a historically Black college and university that served African-American graduate students. It was during his time at Atlanta University that he published The Souls of Black Folk. So again, let's begin our detective work from the outside. We see that this book is bound in cloth instead of leather. So we can kind of do a close-up, see nice textured cloth. So again, this is a telltale sign of the late 19th and early 20th century. Many publishers tried to make their books stand out a little, and so the gold lettering embossed into the cover does just that for this book. And though it's hard to see, you could try to zoom in a little bit, you might be able to see the edge of it. This book actually has a library sticker. So we have a clue that this book was at one time in a public or academic library. When we open the book, we see that this clue is confirmed by a bookplate from the Southern Technical Institute Library. If the Southern Technical Institute does not sound familiar to you, its name in later years might ring a bell. Southern Polytechnic State University. If that doesn't ring a bell, its current name is the Kennesaw State University Marietta campus. So this book has an institutional connection to KSU. However, we also have another clue about this book and who previously owned it, or at least held it. Here on the front free end paper, we see an inscription that reads, "Presented by Mrs. Nellie Adams, January 16th, 1904. We can infer that this book was presented to someone as a gift. We also have another ownership signature up top, which looks to be a bit more contemporary. So multiple people have held and owned this book. Now we can learn a bit more about the book's publication history. The title page has the title of the book and who wrote it, as we would expect. Beneath it, it says third edition, and we will, that actually might mean third printing, but we'll deal with that in a minute. And then right below, we have a little illustration with the publisher's name inside of it. So there's actually a name for this. This is called a publisher's device, which was more common with printers in the hand press period, but some publishers adopted it as well. It's basically a printer's or a publisher's unique imprint on the text. So again, this text was first published in 1903, and lucky for us, we've got on the verso of the title page, it provides a brief printing history of this book. We see that it was first printed in April, it was printed again in June, and then printed here again in August in 1903. So April and then June and August of 1903. Our copy comes from the August print run. So it might, even though it says edition, it might actually be referring to separate printings that took place. But either way, we see kind of where our text might fall within the trajectory of the printings. And so while this information may seem tedious or mundane, it's actually a very big clue regarding public reception of the book. Multiple printings tells us that people were reading this text and it was desired. Finally, we are going to investigate one more book, a book printed post-1950, when dust jackets were the norm and the production of books increasingly involved electronic means. Today, we're going to investigate a fascinating book called Cold Sassy Tree, written by Georgia author Olive Ann Burns and published in 1984. So just like with every other book we've looked at today, we're going to start our investigation from the outside. But unlike the two previous books that we investigated, this book isn't covered in just leather or cloth. It has something special on the outside called a dust jacket. According to the renowned bibliographers George Tansel and Philip Gaskell, the most striking innovation in the presentation for books in the first half of the 20th century was the development of the dust jacket as an advertising medium. Dust jackets often employ artistic trends of the time. They reflect an author's personal style, or they often may have bibliographic information that simply cannot be found anywhere else. So always keep your dust jackets on books, don't throw them away. On the dust jacket for Cold Sassy Tree, which is a novel that takes place in a fictional Georgia town in the early 20th century, the front cover of the dust jacket provides us with some setting. You see, get small town vibes from this dust jacket. Additionally, the back of the dust jacket, the back of the dust jacket includes praise for the novel by Southern writers like Pat Conroy and Pharoah Sams, who compare the novel to the adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Gone with the Wind. So this is a big clue about how this novel was marketed and that it was well received by many of Burns' contemporaries. But that's not all. The dust jacket also helps us get to know the author a bit. We learn that Olive Ann Burns was born in Banks County, Georgia, and attended school in Commerce, Georgia, which is the town upon which she based this novel. She was on the Sunday magazine staff of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and was married to the magazine's editor. So she has many important roots in Georgia. And again, all of this we learn from the dust jacket. So now let's open the book to investigate further. Upon opening the book, we see an inscription. It's an inscription from the author, and it reads, "To Jane and Bill, best wishes, Olive Ann Burns, 10/20/84." So this gives us a clue about the previous owners of the book, Jane and Bill, and the access they had to the author at one point in time. Most of the time, it's really hard to find information about previous owners of books when all you have is their first names. But this book offers us another important clue, an archival item in the form of a postcard. All right. So this postcard was tucked in between the front matter of the book. And just as a side note, I redacted the address on this postcard digitally, not on the actual record. So no markings were made to the actual record. So what additional clues does this postcard give us? Let's read it. All right, so we have a date up here. It says 2. Looks like we have, or some kind of date. We've got 1985, so maybe February 1985, perhaps. So we'll read, "It was a delightful evening at your house, and the lovely ceramic will remind me of it. Thank you so much for your hospitality and for the jug. Best to you, your husband, and the other literary women, Olive Ann Burns." And this postcard is to address to Mrs. Jane E. Lankin, who we can presume is the Jane mentioned in the inscription. And also because I know the donor story behind this book, I can confirm that yes, that's the same Jane. So while the inscription only gave us some kind of early or preliminary evidence that Jane may have met the author, the postcard shows us that they were, at least Jane was a true acquaintance that hobnobbed with the author and other women writers, likely in the Atlanta area. All right. Lastly, I'd like to show one more interesting piece of evidence that I found in this book. This is one of the most common clues that you'll find in books, newspaper clippings. Often, book owners will place newspaper clippings inside of books they own if they feel that the content is relevant or if the clipping helps contextualize the books in some way. It seems that a previous owner, probably Jane, added in a newspaper article that covered a special author reception for Olive Ann Burns, and that was attended by distinguished guests like former presidential First Lady Rosalind Carter and former gubernatorial First Lady Elizabeth Harris. So we're not sure if Jane attended this reception, but the addition of this clipping proves even more clearly that Jane valued this book and the experiences that surrounded its publication. And just as a side note, if you find a newspaper clipping hidden inside of one of your books, be sure to enclose that clipping inside of a piece of archival quality paper or plastic to prevent acid transfer on the actual book itself or some kind of permanent staining, because newspapers will do that to other forms of paper. Well, thank you for joining me on this book detective journey today. It was a wonderful book investigation. I hope you learned some new and interesting ways to search for evidence in books, no matter what era they come from. And I hope that the next time that you open a book, You'll look at it not just as a carrier of content, but as an object with a story. And on my slide, you'll find my contact information. If you have questions about my presentation or just want to chat about books, email me at rarebooks@kennesaw.edu.
Thank you, JoyEllen, for this fascinating detective work. This was wonderful. Look for other Lunch and Learn presentations with other events on this channel. And thank you so much for watching.